At Thanksgiving dinner, my dad praised my sister. She paid off the house. You did nothing. I smiled, pulled out my bank app, and asked, then whose $85,000 is this? The heater in my 10-year-old sedan had given out somewhere past the county line, leaving me shivering in a wool coat that was definitely not thick enough for a late November snowstorm. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, my eyes burning from the glare of oncoming headlights and sheer, unadulterated exhaustion. The rhythmic squeak of my worn-out windshield wipers felt like a metronome counting down the last remnants of my sanity. My name is Morgan. I am 32 years old, and my doctor recently told me that I was hovering right on the edge of total systemic collapse due to adrenal fatigue. I just nodded and told him that was another word for being a senior forensic accountant during a triple merger audit season. I hunt down missing money for a living. I spend my days buried in digital ledgers, tracking offshore accounts, and dissecting the financial lies of corporate executives trying to hide millions from their business partners or their spouses. It is a cynical, exhausting profession that requires you to assume everyone is lying until the math proves otherwise. You learn very quickly that numbers do not have feelings, they do not hold grudges, and they absolutely never lie. People lie. The math is just the trail of crumbs they leave behind. But today, I was not trying to unravel a corporate fraud scheme. I was just trying to drive 4 hours back to my hometown for Thanksgiving dinner without pulling over to throw up from the stress-induced nausea that had become my constant companion. I was physically shattered. My skin was pale and clammy, my back ached from 80-hour work weeks sitting in an ergonomic chair that cost more than my first car, and I had a throbbing headache situated directly behind my left eye that had refused to leave for 3 days. But it was Thanksgiving. And in my family, you did not skip Thanksgiving unless you were legally dead. Even then, my mother, Allison, would probably figure out a way to prop you up at the dining table with a dinner roll in your hand just to keep up appearances. As the miles dragged on, my mind played a familiar, bitter loop. I was tired. I was so unbelievably vulnerable and worn down. I didn't want a parade when I walked through the front door. I didn't want a marching band or a golden plaque. I just wanted a hot meal, a glass of cheap red wine, and maybe a quiet, private nod of validation. I just wanted someone to look at me and acknowledge that the heavy, silent sacrifices I had made for this family over the past 36 months were actually worth it. I wanted to feel like a daughter, not an ATM machine. But as the familiar exit sign for my hometown loomed in the darkness, a cold knot formed in my stomach. The forensic accountant in my brain whispered a warning, a gut feeling I usually reserved for shady CEOs. Something felt off, but I pushed it down, blaming it on the lack of sleep and the freezing temperature in my car. I pulled onto my parents' street, the tires of my car crunching softly against the fresh snow. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had, a stretch of modest, working-class suburban homes built in the late 70s. But as I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, I hit the brakes a little too hard. I sat there in the idling car, the broken heater blowing cold air onto my face, just staring through the windshield. The house looked good. Actually, it looked entirely too good. The front lawn, which was usually a patchy, neglected mess of dying crabgrass by this time of year, had been professionally manicured before the snow fell. The exterior siding of the house, which had been peeling and cracking last summer, so badly that I had offered to find a contractor to fix it, had been freshly coated in a pristine, expensive-looking creamy white paint. The old, rotting wooden steps leading up to the porch had been replaced with composite decking. There were massive, elaborate seasonal wreaths hanging on the front door and the front windows, the kind you buy from high-end boutiques, not the local hardware store. And sitting proudly in the open garage was a brand-new, heavy-duty snowblower that easily retailed for over $1,000. I turned off the ignition, the sudden silence in the car heavy and confusing. I felt a strange, conflicting cocktail of emotions wash over me. My first instinct was a deep, rushing sense of relief. I let out a long breath that turned to white vapor in the cold car. At least the money is actually helping, I whispered out loud to the empty passenger seat. At least they are comfortable. They aren't struggling. That was the narrative I desperately wanted to believe. I wanted to believe that the financial lifeline I had been throwing them was keeping their heads above water so well that they could afford a few nice things. But the cynical auditor in my brain was already doing the mental math. Paint jobs, composite decking, boutique wreaths, and high-end landscaping equipment did not fit into the strict, bare-bones survival budget we had agreed upon. I grabbed my overnight bag and the store-bought pumpkin pie from the passenger seat, my freezing fingers fumbling with the keys. I walked up the new steps, expecting the familiar, comforting smell of roasting turkey, sage stuffing, and my mother's famous buttery dinner rolls to greet me at the door. I expected the quiet, domestic hum of a household preparing for a holiday meal. Instead, as I pushed the front door open, I was greeted by the booming, thunderous sound of my father, Thomas, laughing. It was a deep belly laugh that shook the walls. I froze in the entryway. It was a sound I had not heard directed at me in years. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy and pride. "There she is," Thomas shouted from the living room. For a fraction of a second, my exhausted heart fluttered. I thought he was talking to me. I thought he had seen my car pull up and was genuinely thrilled that his eldest daughter had braved a snowstorm to come home. I started to form a tired but genuine smile. But as I stepped fully into the light of the hallway, holding my pie and my cheap duffel bag, his eyes slid right past me. He wasn't looking at me at all. He was looking at the front door, directly over my shoulder. "My girl," Thomas cheered, taking a step forward, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing right in his path. The front door swung open wider behind me, letting in a blast of freezing wind and a thick, suffocating cloud of expensive, musky designer perfume. My younger sister, Paige, swept into the hallway like she was making a red carpet debut. She was 29 years old, but still carried herself with the dramatic flair of a spoiled teenager. She was draped in a tailored, camel-colored wool coat that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent, and she had a brand-new leather designer handbag slung over her shoulder. Trailing obediently right behind her was her husband, Cameron. Cameron was 33, a man whose actual profession was entirely nebulous. He loved to call himself a serial entrepreneur and an angel investor, but as far as I could ever tell, his primary business model consisted of sleeping until noon, posting motivational quotes on social media, and borrowing money from anyone who stood still long enough to listen to his pitches. He was wearing a dress shirt unbuttoned one button too low, a blazer that was slightly too shiny to be tasteful, and he was hauling an absurdly massive pile of boutique shopping bags and fancy bakery boxes. The gold watch on his wrist, which looked suspiciously like an authentic Rolex, caught the hallway light. I stood there, still in my damp coat, feeling entirely invisible in my own childhood home. It was like I was a ghost haunting a family that didn't know I had died. "Happy Thanksgiving, Dad," I said, my voice coming out raspy and dry. Thomas barely registered my presence. He gave me a brisk, dismissive nod, his eyes locked entirely on Paige. "Move your bag, Morgan," he snapped, pointing a thick finger at my duffel. "You're blocking the hallway. Paige needs space to put her things down. She's had a long drive." I swallowed the sharp, acidic lump of hurt rising in my throat. I picked up my bag and stepped back against the wall, merging with the floral wallpaper. Just then, my mother, Allison, rushed out of the kitchen, wiping her flour-covered hands frantically on an apron. Allison let out a high-pitched squeal of delight. She practically shoved past me to get to Paige, wrapping her arms around her youngest daughter and hugging her so tightly I thought she might crack one of Paige's ribs. She then reached out and gave Cameron an affectionate squeeze on the arm. It was a picture-perfect reunion. Finally, almost as an afterthought, Allison turned and looked at me. Her wide, joyful smile faltered just a fraction of an inch. A nervous, erratic energy seemed to take over her body. Her eyes darted quickly toward Thomas, then to Paige, and finally back to me, but she refused to hold eye contact. "Oh, Morgan. You made it," Allison said, her voice dropping an octave, losing all of its previous warmth. She nervously smoothed down her apron. You look very tired, honey." "I am tired, Mom," I said softly, desperately hoping for just a shred of maternal sympathy. The audit season at the firm has been brutal this year. I've been working, well, don't just stand there blocking the draft, Thomas interrupted loudly, clapping Cameron on the back with a heavy hand. Come on into the dining room, kids. We were just about to pour some drinks and make a toast before we sit down to eat. You're late, Morgan. As usual. I wasn't late. I was exactly 10 minutes early according to the time Allison had told me on the phone. But I simply didn't have the energy to argue. I peeled off my wet coat, hung it on the back of a chair, and followed the Golden family into the dining room. I walked into the dining room and took my designated spot. It was the exact same spot I had sat in since I was 12 years old, the wobbly, uncomfortable wooden chair positioned right next to the swinging kitchen door, ensuring I would be bumped by anyone bringing out food. I sat down and let the ambient noise of the room wash over me. The table was set beautifully. It was the good china, the fragile plates with the gold rims that we were absolutely never allowed to touch growing up. There were heavy crystal water goblets, an elaborate floral centerpiece that must have cost $200, and 3 bottles of red wine that I recognized from a high-end vineyard. Looking at this table, dripping in middle-class luxury, a violent wave of vertigo hit me. My mind violently snapped back to a moment exactly 3 years ago. 3 years ago, this house wasn't filled with laughter and expensive wine. It was filled with the deafening silence of impending ruin. It was a Tuesday night in late October when my mother called me, sobbing so hysterically I could barely understand her words. Thomas had suffered a massive, debilitating heart attack. He survived, but the physical toll forced him into an immediate, permanent, and early retirement from his job as a factory floor manager. I had rushed to the hospital, expecting to comfort a family dealing with a health crisis. Instead, I walked into a financial apocalypse. In the stark, depressing fluorescent light of the hospital room, with the heart monitor beeping steadily in the background, the ugly truth came out. Thomas had been secretly playing the stock market for years. He had taken his secure, guaranteed pension and funneled it into a series of incredibly risky, disastrous investments trying to get rich quick. He had lost almost everything. He had never told my mother until the medical bills started piling up and the mortgage company started calling. They were 90 days behind on their mortgage. The bank had sent the final notices. They were facing imminent foreclosure. They were going to lose the house, their only remaining asset, and end up on the street in their late 50s. I was 29 years old then. I was just barely hitting my stride at the accounting firm, finally starting to build a tiny nest egg for my own future. I wasn't rich by any means, but I was stable. I was the responsible one. The boring one. I remember sitting in that plastic hospital chair, looking at my father who looked so small and broken in his hospital gown, and my mother who was trembling like a leaf. I didn't yell. I didn't berate him for his foolishness. I just opened my laptop, ran their numbers, and built a survival plan. I told them I would handle the shortfall. The very next week, I drove Allison down to the local Chase Bank branch. We sat in a small glass office, and I set up a brand new joint checking account with her name and mine on it. I explained the logistics to her slowly and clearly so Thomas wouldn't have to stress his weak heart with the details. We agreed on a specific number. $2,000. That covered the gap in the mortgage, the rising property taxes, the insurance premiums, and left a small buffer of $300 to make sure they could buy decent groceries. Before we left the bank, I set up an unbreakable, automated transfer from my personal payroll account directly into that joint checking account. Every single month, on the first of the month, at exactly midnight, $2,000 vanished from my life and materialized in theirs. It was a silent, digital lifeline. I made them promise to use it only for the house. It was a contract forged in blood and desperation. Sitting at the wobbly chair now, watching Cameron confidently pop the cork on a bottle of wine that probably cost $80, the reality of what I had given up over the last 36 months felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. People who have never been poor, or who have never had to support their parents, do not understand what $2,000 a month actually means to a single woman in her late 20s. It doesn't just mean a tighter budget. It alters the entire trajectory of your life. For me, It meant continuing to drive a 10-year-old sedan with a broken air conditioner through the blistering city summers because I could not afford the $600 repair bill. It meant sitting in my tiny, drafty, 400-square-foot studio apartment, eating meal-prepped rice and canned black beans for dinner 14 days in a row, while my colleagues at the firm went out to steak dinners and networked for promotions. It meant looking at the invitation to my best friend's destination wedding in Hawaii, crying alone on my couch, and checking the box that said "will not attend," because a $500 plane ticket would mean my parents wouldn't make their mortgage payment that month. I sacrificed my social life, my dating life, and my own financial security. I had decimated my savings. I had put off buying my own condo. I did it silently, dutifully, and without complaining, because they were my parents and I loved them. And while I was freezing in my apartment and working myself into the ground to fund their retirement, my sister Paige was finding herself. Paige and Cameron were the golden couple. Paige had never held a traditional job for longer than 6 months in her entire life. She was a creative spirit, according to my father. First, she decided she was going to be a professional photographer. Thomas and Allison drained their meager emergency savings to buy her a $3,000 camera setup that now gathered dust in her closet. Then, she pivoted to being an artisan jewelry designer. They bought her the raw materials, the tools, the branding packages. That lasted 4 months. Now, she was a lifestyle influencer. She spent her days curating a fake life on the internet, and from what I could gather, Cameron spent his days hyping her up and looking for investors for his imaginary tech startups. Honestly, Paige was saying loudly, waving a manicured hand as she spoke to Thomas. Cameron's crypto portfolio has just been exploding lately. The market is so bullish right now. That's exactly how we were able to afford the down payment on the new Range Rover. But of course, we just wanted to make sure you guys were taken care of first. Family always comes first, obviously. Cameron nodded sagely, taking a large, greedy sip of the red wine. We do what we can, Thomas, Cameron said, his voice oily and smooth. Taking care of my girl, taking care of her folks. That's just the kind of man I am. You're a good man, Cameron, Thomas said, tearing into a warm dinner roll, his eyes shining with adoration. You take care of us. I appreciate it. I sat there, my stomach turning to lead. I looked at Paige. She was wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that I had never seen before. A heavy gold Cartier love bracelet graced her other wrist. I did the mental math instantly. She was wearing roughly $10,000 of jewelry on her arms. A woman who, the last time I checked her social media, was trying to sell discount diet tea to her 300 followers. My hands began to shake beneath the white lace tablecloth. I clamped them together, digging my fingernails hard into my palms, using the sharp bite of physical pain to ground myself. Something was horribly, terribly wrong. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit the subscribe button, leave a like, and comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more viewers. Thank you so much. The meal finally began, and the dining room filled with the heavy, rich scents of roasted turkey, sage dressing, and sweet potatoes. But instead of a comforting family gathering, it felt like I had stumbled into a very poorly written, low-budget reality television show. I sat quietly in my wobbly chair by the kitchen door, mechanically pushing a small pile of mashed potatoes around my china plate. Cameron dominated the conversation from the moment we sat down. He spoke loudly, his mouth half full of food, gesturing wildly with a silver fork. He boasted endlessly about his incredible, entirely vague crypto investments. He used words like blockchain, decentralized finance, and bullish market trends, stringing them together in sentences that made absolutely no financial sense to anyone who actually worked with money. He talked about how he and Paige had just put a massive down payment on a brand new Range Rover, claiming that their digital assets were performing so well they practically had to buy a luxury vehicle just for the tax write-off. Paige sat next to him, practically glowing under the dining room chandelier. She played the role of the modest, supportive, wealthy wife perfectly. She dipped her chin, smiled her tight, practiced smile, and occasionally reached over to pat Cameron's arm when he mentioned how successful they were. She fed off the attention like a vampire, her eyes constantly darting toward Thomas to make sure he was absorbing every single word of their fabricated success story. I stayed quiet, observing the room. That is what you do when you audit a company. You stop talking and you start watching the people. My mother, Allison, was an absolute nervous wreck. She was serving the food with a frantic, jerky energy. She had already finished 2 large glasses of the expensive red wine before anyone else was halfway through their first. Her hands were trembling so badly that when she passed the gravy boat, it rattled violently against the saucer. She kept avoiding my gaze, staring intensely at the floral centerpiece or her own plate. I tried to make a little bit of small talk, just to break the suffocating tension. I asked my father how his physical therapy was going for his heart condition. Thomas just grunted, not even looking up from his turkey, and gave a one-word answer before immediately turning his attention back to Paige, asking her about her new lifestyle influencer brand and the sponsorships she supposedly had lined up. I was entirely shut out. It was as if I was a stranger who had simply wandered in from the snowstorm and taken a seat at their table. About halfway through the meal, Thomas set his silverware down. He reached out and picked up his heavy crystal goblet of red wine. He cleared his throat loudly, the sound echoing in the small room. The table immediately went completely silent. Cameron stopped chewing. Paige sat up straighter, a look of eager anticipation washing over her carefully contoured face. Thomas stood up at the head of the table. He looked at Allison, then he looked at Cameron, and finally, his gaze settled lovingly, adoringly on Paige. His eyes were actually thick with unshed tears. "I want to make a toast," Thomas began, his voice deep and thick with emotion. "I want to give thanks. Because this last couple of years, actually, have been incredibly hard for this family. Since my heart attack, things were dark. We almost lost everything. We almost lost this very house we are sitting in right now." He paused, taking a shaky breath. I straightened up slightly in my chair. I did not want a parade. I did not want a giant, embarrassing public display of gratitude. But a simple nod would be nice. Just a brief acknowledgement of the $2,000 that left my bank account every single month to keep the bank from taking the roof over his head. I had done it silently, dutifully. "But we didn't lose everything," Thomas continued, raising his glass higher toward the ceiling. "And that is thanks to one person. Paige." My heart physically skipped a beat. The air instantly left my lungs. "Your sister is the only reason we are still afloat," Thomas said, his voice booming with pride. "She stepped up when it mattered. She took her hard-earned business money, she took Cameron's investment money, and she saved this family. She paid off the mortgage arrears. She kept the lights on. She saved us from foreclosure." I froze. I sat there, staring at him, completely paralyzed. And then Thomas slowly turned his head. His eyes, which had just been so warm and loving toward Paige, turned incredibly cold and hard as stones as they locked onto me. The disgust on his face was palpable. "And you, Morgan?" Thomas said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. "You have done absolutely nothing. You sit up there in your fancy city apartment with your expensive degree, ignoring your own flesh and blood while your younger sister sacrifices everything to keep your parents off the street. It is shameful. You are a shameful, selfish daughter." For a solid 10 seconds, the room spun out of control. The nausea I had been fighting all day surged so violently I thought I was going to be physically sick right there on the white lace tablecloth. But the nausea was no longer from the flu or from exhaustion. It was from the massive, invisible knife twisting deeply in my back. The betrayal was worse than his medical diagnosis 3 years ago. I couldn't hear anything but the rushing, roaring sound of my own blood pumping in my ears. It was a physical roar, like standing directly underneath a massive waterfall. I looked around the table, desperately waiting for the punchline. I waited for someone, anyone, to laugh and say they were just kidding, that they knew about the money I sent. Nobody laughed. Paige sat there looking incredibly modest, dipping her chin. Cameron looked smug, taking a long, arrogant sip of his wine. And my mother, Allison, was staring a hole into her green beans, a single, thick bead of sweat rolling down the side of her temple. She knew. She had to know. I sent the money directly to her joint account. We discussed the transfers every single month on the telephone. So why was she letting my father believe this insane lie? I looked at Paige again. She looked back at me, and a nasty, triumphant little smirk curled the corner of her lip. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully rewritten our family history because I was the quiet sister. I was the boring accountant who didn't brag, the one who just fixed things behind the scenes and kept her mouth shut. She thought I was weak and defenseless. But as I sat there, the hurt, vulnerable daughter inside of me simply packed her bags and left. In my line of work, we have a very strict saying: emotion is the ultimate enemy of evidence. If you get angry, you get sloppy. If you get sloppy, the money disappears, and the guilty people walk away free. I forced my heart rate to slow down. I forced the burning heat in my cheeks to cool. I engaged the part of my brain that I used when I was sitting across a boardroom table from aggressive corporate executives trying to explain why $20 million had vanished into a shell company in the Cayman Islands. I was no longer a daughter at a Thanksgiving table. I was a senior forensic accountant, and I was currently sitting in the middle of a massive financial crime scene. "Dad," I said. My voice dropped to a register that was terrifyingly calm, steady, and devoid of any emotion whatsoever. "What exactly are you talking about?" "Do not play dumb with me, Morgan," Thomas snapped, slamming his glass down onto the table so hard the red wine sloshed over the rim. He sat down heavily and aggressively unfolded his cloth napkin. "You know exactly what I am talking about. Pass the potatoes, Allison." "I really want to know what you mean," I insisted, leaning forward slightly, my eyes locked dead onto his. "You just said Paige is the reason you are afloat. You said I have done nothing." "Because it is true," Paige interjected, her voice pitching slightly higher in defense. "God, why do you always have to make everything about you? Why can't you just be happy that Cameron and I are doing so well and taking care of things?" "I am just curious, Dad," I said, ignoring Paige completely. "You said Paige paid the mortgage. How exactly does she do that? Does she give you cash?" "No," Thomas frowned, his bluster fading just a tiny fraction at my relentless, calm tone. "She does transfers. Directly from her business accounts into your mother's household account. It is handled. Unlike you, who has not sent a single dime to help us." "Okay," I nodded slowly. "So, if I log into the Chase banking app, the joint account that Mom and I share, I should see incoming transfers from Paige, right? Thousands of dollars a month to cover the mortgage." The silence that stretched across the dining room table was suddenly heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "Don't you dare," Paige hissed. All the color instantly drained from her face. The carefully applied blush stood out starkly against her sudden, sickly pallor. "You do not have the right to look at Mom's private banking information at the dinner table. That is a violation of privacy. It is a joint account, Paige. My name is on the paperwork." "I am legally a primary account holder," I said smoothly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. My thumb hovered over the biometric scanner, unlocking the screen instantly. I opened the primary banking application. The bright white light of the display cut through the dim, candlelit ambience of the dining room. "Put the phone away, Morgan," Thomas barked, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "I will not have you disrespecting your sister and her husband with your petty jealousy on Thanksgiving." I didn't put the phone away. I tapped the screen to navigate to the deposit history of the joint account. I waited 1 second for the little loading wheel to spin, and the data populated on the screen. "This is fascinating, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "I am looking at the deposit history for the last 12 months. Let us look at the facts. November 1st. Incoming transfer, $2,000. Sender, Morgan. October 1st. Incoming transfer, $2,000. Sender, Morgan. September 1st. I looked up from the screen and stared directly at my father. I see my automated transfers hitting this account like clockwork every single month for 36 months. But Dad, I am scrolling through an entire year of banking history, and I do not see a single dime deposited by Paige. Not one red cent. "Let me see that," Thomas demanded, reaching his hand across the table. I handed him the phone. He held it close to his face, his heavy brows furrowed in deep confusion. He scrolled his thick finger up the screen. He scrolled down. He was looking at stark black text on a bright white background. It was undeniable proof that his narrative, the one where his golden child was the savior and I was the villain, was fundamentally flawed. It is technical. Paige suddenly shrieked, jumping to her feet. Her chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. We use a different transfer protocol, Dad. It is crypto-backed. It does not show up as a standard bank deposit immediately. It has to clear through a decentralized third-party vendor. She does not know what she is looking at. Crypto-backed transfer protocols do not make invisible deposits, Paige, I said, staring her down with absolute disgust. Money is either in the checking account or it is not in the checking account. And according to the bank, the only money coming into this house to pay the bills is the money I sacrificed my own life to send. Thomas slowly lowered the phone. He looked at his wife. He suddenly looked incredibly old. The aggressive bluster had completely drained out of him, replaced by a confused, terrifying fear. "Allison," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. "What is this? Where is Paige's money?" My mother burst into tears. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, wailing sob, the kind of breakdown that comes from years of holding back a massive dam of anxiety and lies. She buried her face in her cloth napkin, her shoulders heaving violently. "I couldn't tell you," Allison sobbed loudly. "I couldn't." "Couldn't tell me what?" Thomas demanded, his voice rising in panic. "That Paige isn't paying the mortgage?" "She tries," Allison cried out, looking up with red, desperate eyes. She reached out and grabbed Paige's hand. "Paige tries so hard, Thomas. But the lifestyle business, it takes time to build a brand. She needed help. She needed inventory to look successful for the sponsors." "So you lied to me," Thomas said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You told me she was paying the mortgage with her business money. I just wanted you to be proud of her." Allison wailed, deflecting her massive shame into defensive anger. "You were always so hard on her. And Morgan has a good corporate job. She can afford to send the money. What does it matter who gets the credit, Thomas? It all goes into the same family pot." "It matters," I said, feeling a cold, bitter laugh bubble up in my chest because of the withdrawals. I stood up from my chair and walked over to my father. I reached out, gently took my phone from his trembling hand, and tapped the screen to switch the view from deposits to withdrawals. "Look at the outgoing payments, Dad," I instructed coldly. "Not the mortgage payments. Look at the other ones." Thomas looked down at the glowing screen again. He squinted, reading the lines out loud. "Venmo. Venmo to Paige Lifestyle, $500 November 3rd. Venmo to Paige Lifestyle, $800 November 10th. Cash withdrawal, $400. He looked up, his face entirely gray. He looked like he was going to have another heart attack. "Allison, what is this?" "Let me get this totally straight," I said, pacing a tight circle in the small dining room. "I live in a tiny studio, I drive a broken car, and I send you $2,000 a month, so you do not lose your home. Mom takes my money, and instead of paying the bank, she funnels thousands of dollars out the back door directly to Paige via Venmo to fund her fake Instagram business and buy designer handbags. Which leads me to the most important question, Mom." I stopped pacing and locked eyes with my weeping mother. "If you gave my money to Paige, what exactly happened to the mortgage?" "It gets paid," Paige yelled, her voice bordering on hysterical. She was gripping the edge of the dining table so hard her knuckles were white. "The house gets paid. Stop acting like we are criminals, Morgan. You are just trying to ruin Thanksgiving because you are a lonely, miserable workaholic who no one loves." "You hacked that banking app," Cameron spat, stepping out from behind Paige, trying to puff out his chest and look physically intimidating. "You don't know the first thing about our complex family finances. You just photoshopped a fake screenshot." "Oh, I think I know exactly how complex they are," I said, ignoring his pathetic attempt at intimidation. Without breaking eye contact with Cameron, I typed a new website address into my phone's browser. I went directly to the web portal for my parents' mortgage lender. I knew the website well, and I knew the complex password by heart because I was the one who had set up the online account for them 3 years ago when the crisis first began. Don't you dare. Paige lunged toward me, trying to snatch the phone from my hands. I easily sidestepped her. She stumbled awkwardly in her expensive heels, crashing into the wooden sideboard and knocking over a decorative vase of dried flowers. It shattered loudly on the floor. The web page loaded. I stared at the screen. My stomach, which I thought had already hit rock bottom, plummeted straight through the floorboards. It was so much worse than I had originally hypothesized. "Oh my God," I whispered softly. The entire room went completely silent. Even Paige stopped her frantic theatrics, panting heavily by the sideboard, her perfect hair disheveled. "What?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "Morgan, what is it?" "Dad," I said, looking at him with genuine, profound pity. "When was the last time you physically looked at a piece of mail from the bank? A physical mortgage statement?" "I don't know," Thomas rubbed his face tiredly. "Allison handles the mail. She said we went paperless to save the environment." "You're paperless," I confirmed softly. "Which is exactly why you did not see the red letters in the mail. You didn't see the foreclosure notices." "Foreclosure?" The word came out of Thomas's mouth like a strangled gasp of air. "You are 3 months behind on the house," I said, reading the bright red alert text displayed prominently on the portal screen. Status: pre-foreclosure. Amount needed to reinstate the loan immediately, $5,800. Last payment received by the bank was in July. I looked at my mother. Allison wasn't crying anymore. She was sitting rigidly in her chair, staring blankly at the wall, completely catatonic. She had dissociated from reality. The sheer weight of what she had done, enabling Paige to the point of destroying their entire lives, was simply too much for her brain to process. "No," Thomas whispered, shaking his head back and forth in denial. "No, that is impossible." Paige said she paid it off. She said she made a massive lump sum payment in August with her crypto earnings to clear the entire debt. "There is no crypto money, Dad," I said firmly. "They are broke. They are living entirely off the money I sent you." I looked back down at the screen, tapping on the detailed payment history tab. The forensic accountant in me was looking for the final puzzle piece. How did they hide it for so long before July? "And it gets worse," I said, feeling a cold, hard anger crystallize in the center of my chest. "Dad, look at the payment source for the few small payments that were actually made earlier this year before they completely stopped paying." I walked over and placed the phone flat on the table in front of him. Payment from Discover credit card. They were paying the mortgage company using a credit card. "I do not have a Discover card," Thomas said, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I haven't had a credit card in 10 years. "Apparently, you do," I said quietly. "Mom, did you open a credit card in Dad's name without his permission?" Allison didn't answer. She just rocked slightly back and forth in her chair. "Paige," I said, turning my furious gaze to my sister. "Did you open a high-limit credit card using your father's social security number?" Mom said it was okay. Paige cried out, bursting into fresh, panicked tears. She signed the digital papers. We needed the credit line to buy inventory for the brand. We maxed it out, but we were going to pay it off when the sponsorships hit. "It is a business strategy." "It is not a strategy," I said, my voice echoing like a gunshot in the dining room. "It is felony identity theft." Thomas stood up. He looked incredibly frail, shaky, and tired beyond his years. He slowly walked over to where Paige was standing by the shattered vase. She looked up at him, her large eyes wide and pleading, expecting him to comfort her. She expected the usual, lifelong pattern to hold true. She made a terrible mess, she cried, and her father fixed it and told her she was perfect. "Daddy," Paige whimpered, reaching out a trembling hand to touch his sleeve. "I am so sorry. I just wanted to be successful. I wanted to be rich so I could buy you nice things." Thomas looked down at her outstretched hand. He did not take it. He looked at the expensive tailored coat she was wearing. He looked at the $10,000 worth of jewelry sparkling on her wrists, bought with the money meant to keep him from freezing on the street. And then, he looked across the room at me, The daughter he had just called shameful, the daughter he had accused of doing absolutely nothing. "You are not successful, Paige," Thomas said. His voice cracked, breaking in the middle of the sentence. "You are a thief." Paige physically flinched backward as if he had struck her across the face. Thomas then turned his gaze slowly to Cameron, who was trying very hard to blend into the wallpaper near the hallway. "And you? You are a useless parasite." "Now hold on just a second, old man." Cameron started to bristle, taking a half step forward, his fake confidence momentarily returning. "Get out," Thomas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "What?" Cameron blinked, stunned. "Get out of my house," Thomas roared, the sheer volume shaking the crystal glasses on the table. "Pack your designer bags, pack your fake inventory, and get the hell out of my house right now." "Dad, you cannot be serious." Paige shrieked, sheer panic replacing the tears. "It is snowing outside. Where are we supposed to go?" "We gave up our apartment lease in the city because we couldn't afford it." "Go to a luxury hotel," Thomas said bitterly. "Use the Discover card." "Oh wait. You maxed it out." "I do not care where you go. But you are not staying here." "Mom." Paige turned to Allison, screaming desperately. "Mom, do something. He is kicking us out. It is Thanksgiving." And then my mother finally snapped out of her catatonic state and started screaming. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated panic as the enabler's perfectly constructed world collapsed into debris. "You can't do this, Thomas." Allison shrieked, jumping up and grabbing his shirt lapels, shaking him. "It is too cold outside. It is dark. They have nowhere to go. They will freeze." "They are 30 years old, Allison." Thomas yelled back, violently pushing her hands away from his chest. "They are grown adults, and they have robbed us completely blind. They looked me in the eye and lied to me for 3 years while Morgan starved herself to pay for the roof over our heads. And I sat at this table and insulted her. I insulted the only daughter who actually gives a damn if we live or die." Thomas looked at me then. Tears were streaming freely down his weathered cheeks. "I am sorry, Morgan," he whispered, his voice breaking completely. "God, I am so unbelievably sorry." Seeing our father apologize to me, actually, genuinely apologize, broke something fundamental inside Paige's brain. She realized her golden reign was permanently over. She grabbed her expensive leather handbag, hurled a string of vile, hateful curses at me, calling me a soulless corporate drone, and stormed toward the front door. Cameron scrambled quickly behind her, terrified of Thomas's wrath. Thomas stood in the hallway and watched them drag their boutique shopping bags out into the freezing snowstorm. "Leave the rest of your garbage," Thomas shouted out the door. "I will put it on the curb tomorrow morning. Do not ever come back here." He slammed the heavy oak door shut. The house shook. And then, the silence that followed was absolute and profound. For a long time, no one moved. My mother collapsed back into her chair, sobbing quietly, mourning the loss of her favorite child. My father stood leaning against the front door, staring at the wood grain as if expecting it to provide answers to the questions that were tearing his soul apart. I did not gloat. I did not feel a sense of triumphant victory. I just felt incredibly tired. But the job was not finished. I walked out to my freezing car, grabbed my heavy work laptop from the trunk, and brought it back inside. I cleared a space at the dining room table, pushing aside the cold turkey and the spilled red wine, and flipped the screen open. "Dad," I said softly, motioning for him to come sit down next to me. He walked over slowly, looking like a hollow shell of a man, and sank into the chair. "I can fix the mortgage," I told him, looking him directly in the eye. "I have enough in my emergency savings to pay the $5,800 tomorrow morning and pull the house out of pre-foreclosure. You will not lose the house." "You shouldn't have to do that," Thomas said, shaking his head, refusing to look at me out of pure shame. "You have paid enough. We ruined you." "I will do it," I said firmly. "But I am doing it on one non-negotiable condition. I am taking over the finances. Completely." He looked up at me. "Anything. I want full, legal power of attorney over this house and all of your banking accounts until every single cent of debt is cleared," I stated clearly, laying down the law. "No more secrets. No more, Mom handles the mail. I see absolutely everything. I pay the bills directly from a secured account. And Mom, I raised my voice, directing it at Allison, who was still sniffling in the corner. If you ever secretly give Paige a $20 bill, if you ever pay a cell phone bill for her, or buy her a bag of groceries, I am gone. I walk away forever, the house goes to the bank, and I never look back. Do you understand me? Allison nodded weakly, wiping her eyes. The power she had held as the gatekeeper of the family's secrets was entirely gone. Good. Now, Dad, I need you to recite your social security number to me, I said, opening a secure background check software on my laptop. We need to see exactly how much damage they did with your identity. He gave me the number. I ran a hard credit check. The results were a bloodbath. The Discover card was not maxed out at $10,000. It was maxed out at $42,000. There was also a personal line of credit at a local credit union that was overdrawn by an additional $5,000. In total, Paige and Cameron had siphoned nearly $50,000 of fraudulent debt onto my father's name, on top of the $36,000 in cash they had bled from the mortgage money I had sent. They had stolen and wasted over $85,000 to fund a pathetic, hollow illusion of internet fame. We have to file a formal police report, I said, turning the laptop screen so Thomas could see the horrifying numbers. To clear this fraudulent debt with the credit card companies, we have to officially claim identity theft. That means filing criminal charges against Paige and Cameron tonight. Morgan, please no, Allison started to beg, but Thomas held up a strict hand, silencing her instantly. Do it, Thomas said. His voice was hard, cold, and entirely resolute. File the report. If they have to learn the hard way, then they learn the hard way. I filed the police report online right there at the Thanksgiving table. The next few months were an absolute blur of stressful legal meetings, bank appointments, and aggressive financial restructuring. I did not just fix their finances, I built a fortress around them. I set up a legal trust for the house so it could never be leveraged or borrowed against again. I consolidated the remaining debt. Paige and Cameron did not go to federal prison, but only because I stepped in and negotiated a brutal deal with the prosecutors. I agreed not to push for maximum sentencing if they agreed to a legally binding, wage-garnishing repayment plan and signed a permanent restraining order regarding my parents' financial assets. The stress of having no money and facing legal consequences destroyed their fake relationship instantly. Their marriage did not last through the winter. Cameron moved back into his mother's basement in Ohio. Paige was forced to get a real job. She is currently working 50 hours a week as a receptionist at a local dental office just to make her court-ordered restitution payments. The luxury lifestyle brand is completely dead. As for me, I visited my parents last week. The house is safe. The mortgage is current. We sat on the newly painted porch drinking iced tea in the spring weather. It was peaceful. I am proud of you, Morgan, my dad said out of nowhere, watching a bird land on the lawn. I was blinded by the flash and the noise of her lies. But you're the solid ground. You always were. I took his weathered hand. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't running away from the financial anxiety. I had faced it, I had audited the truth, and I had balanced the ledger. I was finally at peace. I protected my parents from homelessness, but my mother still occasionally cries over how I ruined Paige's life by exposing her fraud and forcing her to get a real job. Am I the jerk for not showing my sister any mercy, or did she get exactly what she deserved? Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button and leaving a like. It really helps the channel grow so I can bring you more incredible stories every single day. See you in the next one.